Hello, everyone. My name is Brennan Marr. That noise you're hearing is my ventilator. Welcome to One with the Force, presented by Page Turners They Were Not, my Star Wars podcast. Um, I wanted to briefly discuss something that's been on my mind lately, and that is Andor and the Force. Um, I think that there's been some discussion, or lack of discussion, about this. Andor is unique, being one of the very few Star Wars projects that does not involve, or basically, there is nobody in it actively using the Force. And what I mean by that is whether they're a Jedi or a Sith, or just a Force user of some kind, there isn't anyone who uses it in that way in Andor. Um, Now, there has been some discussion of people saying, finally, a Star Wars show without the Force. Well, I have to completely disagree with that, um, personally, because Andor and the story does have the Force. Now, I don't mean just the Force healer. By the way, the idea of having the Force healer was a great idea because it so ties in to the rest of Star Wars. And of course, the idea that Cassian Andor himself has a destiny, which is absolutely true, as we know. Um, but I think that those who say, finally, a Star Wars show without any of that silly magic force stuff might be missing the point entirely. So let me explain what I mean. Let us cast our minds back to A New Hope and The Empire Strikes Back. What do we learn from Obi-Wan and Yoda? That the Force exists in all living things. In fact, the Force is created by all living things. It exists in all things and through all things. Yoda says luminous beings are we. Yeah, the Force exists in all living beings. And therefore, our characters in Andor, it exists in them too. One of the common misconceptions about Star Wars is the Jedi have the Force and regular people don't. And it's actually against what Star Wars has always been about, which is that the Force exists in all living things and nobody has the Force. Some people are able to access and use it actively. But nobody has it. No one possesses it. From a religious standpoint, I believe in the power of God. I believe that everyone, in some fashion, has access to that power because God has delegated that power to his people. It does not belong to any of us, though. It belongs to him. It's the same thing with the Force. The Force doesn't belong to anyone. The Force is a power that everyone has. And I'm repeating myself here. But let me get to the point. So, nobody in Andor actively uses the Force except the Force healer. We don't see anyone using it to do anything. But what we have learned about the Force over the years is that it exists. And we don't know to what extent the characters in Andor are Force sensitive. We do not know. But there's a moment you might remember when Luthen Rael says to Cassian, basically, why is it you were there every time I needed you? And then he says, Aldani, Narkina, Ferrex, Gorman. He just goes on and it's not a coincidence that Cassian was at those places. Now, my own headcanon is telling me that Luthen believes, or at least at one time did believe, in the Force. Now, this is my headcanon. This is not official. And I'm thinking maybe he believed in it, and after a while started to lose faith because of the lifestyle that he chose of being this very dour, grumpy, nihilistic person. But I wonder if in that moment he starts to go, wait a minute. The fact that Cassian was there at those times has to be more than a coincidence. So I wonder if even Luthen started to go, wait a minute, maybe there is some truth here. We know that in the galaxy there are people like Han Solo who really don't believe or accept the Force. It exists nonetheless. But the way that I look at Andor and subsequently Rogue One is that the Force is guiding this whole story. We learned from the Force healer that Cassian has a destiny, but like all the characters in Star Wars, it's all about choosing that destiny. That destiny is guided by the Force. But Cassian, as we saw in Rogue One, had to make the choice to trust Jyn Erso and trust in the idea of going and stealing the Death Star plans. And we saw where that led, because not only Did getting the Death Star plans lead to the destruction of the Empire's most dangerous weapon? But it also led to the moment when Luke Skywalker embraced the Force and became the new hope of the galaxy. Now, one of the things that has been discussed about Andor is some people are saying, oh, finally, it's a more realistic story. Well, let's be clear, Andor is still fantasy. Andor is Star Wars, and Star Wars is fantasy. So, in that regard, it still is a fantasy. And yes, it's about the more average inhabitants of the galaxy. But I don't know if I would call these characters average. These are people who stepped up to the challenge. And whether or not they believed in the Force, whether or not they were sensitive to the Force, the Force was in them and through them the whole time. So even though we don't see a lot of use of the Force, doesn't mean it's not there. Star Wars, the whole story, every piece of Star Wars that has ever existed is ultimately about the Force. And Andor is a great example of a story where, even though we don't see anyone use the Force, it's there. The Bad Batch is another example of we only run into one or two characters that can actually use the Force. But as we know, Omega is Force sensitive. In fact, very much so, apparently. And yet we never see her actively use it. The same thing going on here in Andor is, even though we don't see anyone use it, it's there. And I'm glad to have that in Star Wars. Particularly with the Force healer, but also without her. There is a great lesson, I think, to be learned here. Is that the Force is there in this story, whether it can be seen or not, it's there. And that is a great message for us because I believe that the light of God is in all of us. Even if we can't always see it or it isn't apparent, it's there and it's all about learning to trust in it, learning to choose that destiny. One other thing I wanted to comment on really, really quick is the Force equals hope. If you go Andor Season 1, Andor Season 2, Rogue One, and A New Hope, what you are seeing is a step ladder going from no hope to a new hope. And slowly but surely more light is creeping in. The Empire has tried to completely destroy belief in anything other than the Empire. They don't want people believing in the Force. They don't want people having a hope of anything else because they know that they would lose their power if people believed in something else. The idea of going from Andor season 1, where we see nobody use the Force, Andor season 2, where we see one person using the Force, and another person, in the case of Bix, believing in it. Rogue One, where you have Chirrut Imlay and Baze Malbus, even Jyn herself believing in the Force. You have A New Hope, which is all about the light of the Force. So basically, it is a step ladder going from no hope to a new hope. And in my opinion, that's because the Force is making itself more and more visible. So all of this to say, the Force is in Andor. It is not a show without the Force. In fact, the Force, in my mind, is very much at the center of the story. So those are my thoughts on Andor and the Force. I hope it makes sense. But I'm glad to be able to talk about this because I believe that the message is even stronger because it's not as apparent. So those are my thoughts on Andor and the Force. My name is Brennan Moore. I don't know if you're hearing it, but that's later. Thank you for tuning in to One with the Force, presented by Page Turners They Were Not, my Star Wars podcast. May the Force be with you.